Whispers on Steel, Book 1 of the Railway Inheritance, written by Melody Gilly. Chapter 7. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall struck 3 as Sullivan laid the documents across his study desk. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows where generations of Von Vogel men had plotted railway empires, negotiated contracts, and guarded family secrets. He organized the recovered items with methodical precision. Property deeds in one stack, financial records in another, correspondence in a third. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, while his mind replayed moments from the evening. Sonya's expression in the restaurant firelight, her fingers brushing his as they examined the hidden documents, the gentle weight of her hands upon his in the moonlight. "Focus," he muttered, forcing his attention back to the task. The final metal box contained the most valuable find, Sebastian's private logbook from 1941 to 1943, with coded entries about special shipments, weights, and destinations. The small leather-bound volume contained enough evidence to confirm what Sullivan had long suspected. His uncle's operations had been far more complex than simple wartime profiteering. Names appeared in the margins: intelligence officers, government officials, resistance contacts, suggesting networks that extended beyond commercial shipping into something more clandestine, and potentially more damning. Sullivan poured himself a generous measure of scotch, the amber liquid catching the moonlight as he carried the glass to the window. Outside, whispering pines grounds stretched towards the moors, ancient oaks standing sentinel around form gardens long since surrendered to the wilderness. Beyond the property's edge, he could make out the abandoned railway line where, hours earlier, he'd walked with Sonya Matthews. The window glass before him bore spiderweb cracks from his earlier rage, the damaged pane hastily covered with heavy burgundy drapes that now lay partially open. His reflection fragmented across the broken surface, many Sullivans staring back at him from slightly different angles, each bearing the same troubled expression. Sonya. The name echoed in his mind, no longer just a strategic target, but a woman of flesh and blood and disarming intelligence. He'd approached her with calculation, seeking information about her mother's journals, about Gregory Constant's investigation. Yet somewhere between the bookshop and the moonlit tracks, something had shifted fundamentally. Foolishness, he told his fractured reflection. Utter madness. The scotch burned pleasantly as he drank, warming a chest that had felt strangely hollow since leaving her at the cottage. Morrison would arrive at dawn to review the documents and plan the next phase of their railway resurrection. Sullivan needed clarity, focus, detachment, not this unsettling preoccupation with Helena Matthews' daughter. He moved restlessly about the study, shadows shifting with his passage. Portraits of Von Vogel patriarchs gazed down from wood-paneled walls, stern, successful men who had built the family fortune through strategic marriages and ruthless business acumen. Men who would never have allowed sentiment to compromise ambition. Yet even as Sullivan acknowledged the absurdity, images form unbidden in his mind. Sonya at Whispering Pines. Her golden hair caught morning light as she browsed the library's first editions. Sonya beside him at railway board meetings, her intelligence and insight strengthening his position. Sonya in his bed, her eyes holding his as he... The crystal tumbler shattered against the fireplace, fragments exploding into diamond like shards across the hearth. "Control yourself," he hissed into the empty room. His hands trembled slightly, an unfamiliar sensation that triggered both concern and fascination. When had any woman affected him thus? When had he last felt so fundamentally destabilized? Sullivan pressed his palms against the desk's polished surface, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Rational thought, strategic assessment, that's what the situation required. A Matthews-Von Vogel alliance made a certain logical sense. Gregory Constant's investigation would lose its impetus if his niece married the subject. Helena's journal would become family documents rather than potential evidence. The symbolic reconciliation of wartime adversaries would make a compelling narrative as the railway lines reopened. He began to pace, mind racing with possibilities. Marriage, children, dynasty. The von Vogel bloodline continued through new generations who would inherit both legacies, healing historical wounds through their very existence. But Sonya herself, her literary mind, her quiet courage, her genuine warmth, these qualities existed beyond calculation. He found himself remembering her laugh when he'd made particularly dry observation about village politics. The intelligence in her questions about the railway documents, the way moonlight had silvered her profile as she gazed down the abandoned tracks. She would never agree, he murmured, continuing his restless circuit of the room. Not once she knows everything. Not once she learned about Harold's death at his hands, about the clandestine cargo still moving along restored sections of track, about Morrison's operations and Sullivan's role within them, about the darkness that sometimes overwhelmed him, turning the methodical businessman into something more dangerous. Sullivan paused before the portrait of his uncle Sebastian, handsome, imposing, secrets hidden behind a confident smile. Had he felt this same conflict when Helena Matthews entered his world? This same impossible yearning for someone who represented both desire and destruction? I could convince her, Sullivan whispered to his uncle's painted eyes. I could show her the larger vision, the restored glory. I could... A door slammed somewhere in the mansion's depths, the sound echoing through empty corridors. Sullivan froze, listening. Whispering pines settled and shifted constantly, and again structure with old bones and older secrets. He'd grown accustomed to its nocturnal symphony, creaking floorboards, whispering drafts, the occasional inexplicable footstep. But the timing felt deliberate, an interruption of his spiraling fantasy, a reminder perhaps of the mansion's other ghostly inhabitants, his mother, his father, Elizabeth, Sebastian, Harold, all watching his growing obsession with concern or amusement or judgment. Sullivan straightened his posture, running hands through disheveled hair. Dawn approached, and with it, Morrison. The scattered documents required organization, the evidence cataloging, the next steps planning. Sonya Matthews had become a dangerous distraction from the mission that had driven him for years, restoring the Von Vogel legacy, rebuilding what history and enemies had dismantled. With deliberate focus, he returned to the desk, separating documents into precise categories. Each paper received individual attention, each detail noted in his meticulous handwriting. The work steadied him, providing familiar structure for a mind temporarily derailed by unexpected emotion. By the time gravel crunched beneath tires outside, Sullivan Von Vogel had reassembled his customary facade. Calm, controlled, strategic, the tumbler fragments had been cleared away, the documents arranged for optimal presentation, his appearance restored to its usual impeccable standard. Only his eyes, had anyone looked closely enough, might have betrayed the internal earthquake that had momentarily shaken his foundations. Morrison entered without knocking, early morning light silhouetting his silver hair as he stood in the doorway. "Productive night, I see," he observed, noting the organized documents. "You found them all?" "3 boxes so far," Sullivan replied, voice steady, "including Sebastian's private logbook." Morrison's expression sharpened with interest. "Excellent. The final piece of our infrastructure resurrection." He moved to examine the materials, his professional assessment revealing nothing about their potential explosiveness. As Morrison circled the study, he paused briefly on the cracked window partially visible behind the burgundy curtains. His eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the spider web pattern of fractures, before returning to the documents without comment. For the next 2 hours, they worked methodically through the recovered documents, plotting legal strategies, identifying leverage points with the railway board, and calculating financial requirements for the restoration project. Sullivan participated fully, his analytical mind functioning with customary precision despite the emotional turbulence that still churned beneath his composed exterior. "The Dresden connection documentation is particularly valuable," Morrison noted, examining a folder of permits. These establish precedent for cross-border operations that current regulations cannot easily override. Sullivan nodded, adding another page to the strategic portfolio they were assembling. Morning light now streamed through the study windows, highlighting the cracked pane that fractured the sunbeam into prismatic patterns across the carpeting. A sudden draft extinguished one of the desk candles, though no window stood open. Morrison glanced up, his gaze tracking the length of the shadowed room before settling momentarily on the damaged window again. "This place," he said, voice deliberately casual. "It has a certain atmosphere. Whispering Pines has stood for over a century," Sullivan replied, not looking up from his notes. "It carries its history in its walls." "Indeed." Morrison rose, stretching subtly. "Have you considered alternate living arrangements? Something more contemporary?" The Morrison Group maintains several properties that... "Whispering Pines is my home," Sullivan interrupted, voice cooling perceptibly. "The Von Vogel seat for generations." "Of course," Morrison conceded smoothly, though perhaps modernization might be considered. The East Wing appears largely unused, the staff quarters entirely vacant since Harold's retirement. As if emphasizing his point, Morrison stepped closer to the damaged window, adjusting the curtain to better cover the cracked glass. The gesture seemed casual, but his eyes missed nothing. Neither the impact point at the center of the fractures nor the faint bloodstains on the lower edge where Sullivan's knuckles had made contact. Sullivan's pen paused momentarily before continuing its steady notation. "I find solitude conducive to clear thinking." Solitude, yes. Morrison moved away from the window, looking out over the overgrown gardens through an undamaged pane. Though there is solitude, and then there is isolation. The line between them can blur, particularly in a house with such history. A floorboard creaked overhead, though no one occupied the upper floors. Both men heard it. Neither acknowledged it directly. "Your concern is noted," Sullivan said, voice neutral. Morrison turned from the window, studying his protégé with experienced eyes. "You seem different this morning." "Our meeting with the Matthews girl. It was informative." "Miss Matthews proved unexpectedly forthcoming," Sullivan replied carefully. "Gregory Constant's absence provided opportunity for reconnaissance." "Reconnaissance only. I trust." Morrison's tone remained light, though his gaze sharpened. "Pretty faces have derailed greater enterprises than ours, Sullivan." "My focus remains absolute," Sullivan stated, meeting the older man's eyes with practiced conviction. "The Von Vogel legacy, the railway resurrection. Nothing supersedes these priorities." Morrison nodded, seemingly satisfied, though something in his expression suggested he'd glimpsed more than Sullivan intended to reveal. His gaze flickered once more to the covered window, the damaged glass a silent testament to violent emotions that Sullivan's composed demeanor now concealed. "Good." He gathered his copy of their compiled notes. "Because the next phase requires absolute commitment. The Yorkshire-Hamburg connection will face significant regulatory opposition once publicly announced. We cannot afford complications." The warning hung in the air between them, its target unspecified yet unmistakable. "There will be no complications," Sullivan assured him, voice steady despite the renewed turmoil beneath. As Morrison departed, promising to initiate the legal proceedings based on their recovered documentation, Sullivan remained in his study. The morning sun illuminated dust motes dancing in golden beams, lending the room a dreamlike quality despite its shabby grandeur. The damaged window cast fractured light patterns across the floor, a visual echo of Sullivan's splintered composure. He moved to the window, watching Morrison's car disappear down the winding drive. Whispering Pines settled around him, its ancient timbers creaking, its empty corridors echoing with absent footsteps, its walls holding decades of Von Vogel triumphs and tragedies. "No complications," he repeated to the empty room, as if convincing himself. Somewhere in the mansion's depths, a door closed softly, though no hand had touched it. The Waverly Club occupied a discreet Georgian townhouse in central London, its membership limited to gentlemen of a certain standing, former diplomats, retired intelligence officers, and senior civil servants whose names rarely appeared in newspapers. The establishment prided itself on two particular virtues: absolute privacy and impeccable service. James Morrison sat alone in a secluded alcove of the reading room, fountain pen moving deliberately across the cream-colored pages of a leather journal. The afternoon light filtered through leaded windows, casting gentle shadows across the polished mahogany table where a half-finished creme brulee and cooling coffee awaited his attention. He paused in his writing, considering his phrasing carefully before continuing. Sullivan's focus appears increasingly fragmented. The Matthews girl represents a potential complication I had not fully anticipated. While her presence offers certain strategic advantages, proximity to Constant, access to Helena's journals, S shows concerning signs of personal interest beyond operational parameters. The window incident suggests emotional instability requiring monitoring. Morrison tapped the pen against his lower lip, then added, "Contingency measures may become necessary. An accelerated timeline is advisable." He was closing the journal when a familiar voice broke the library's silence. "The Assam tea here is quite exceptional. I've always found it pairs remarkably well with their lemon tart." Morrison looked up to find Gregory Constant standing before him, immaculate in a well-preserved tweed suit that had been fashionable 2 decades earlier. The former inspector's posture remained military straight despite his advancing years, his piercing blue eyes undimmed by time. "Inspector Constant," Morrison replied, betraying neither surprise nor displeasure. What an unexpected convergence of trajectories. "Former inspector," Gregory corrected mildly, though habits of observation persist beyond official capacity. "Indeed." Morrison closed his journal with deliberate calm, securing its clasp before tucking it into his inner pocket. "Please join me. Though I confess some curiosity as to your presence at the Waverly, I wasn't aware you held membership." Gregory settled into the opposite chair, his movements economical yet graceful for a man his age. "Commander Whittington sponsors me as a guest when I'm in London. We share certain historical interests." "Whittington," Morrison repeated softly. "May 6, Northern European desk during the war, if memory serves." A flicker of appreciation crossed Gregory's features. "Your recall remains impressive, Mr. Morrison, as does your network of associations." The waiter appeared silently at their table. Gregory ordered the recommended tea and lemon tart, while Morrison requested fresh coffee. Only when they were alone again did the conversation resume. "Yorkshire must be exceptionally quiet to drive you to London for stimulation," Morrison observed. "Or perhaps family obligations prove more demanding than anticipated." "My niece has settled in quite comfortably," Gregory replied, seemingly happy to address the oblique reference, though she finds herself more drawn to literary pursuits than family history. "The past holds limited appeal for her generation, I'm afraid." Morrison tapped one manicured fingernail against the fine china of his coffee cup. "How disappointing for your ongoing research efforts." "On the contrary, her disinterest provides me greater freedom to pursue other avenues." Gregory's smile was pleasant yet somehow predatory. "Young people today prefer creating their own stories rather than excavating old ones." "An admirable quality," Morrison agreed smoothly. "Though sometimes the most compelling narratives emerge from historical foundations." Their refreshments arrived, momentarily pausing the verbal chess match. Gregory added a precise amount of milk to his tea, stirring 3 times counterclockwise, a habit Morrison had observed decades earlier during their first encounters. "I understand congratulations may be in order," Gregory remarked after his first appreciative sip. "Morrison Transport's acquisition of the Eastern Continental shipping routes represents quite a coup, particularly the Hamburg terminal facilities." The comment carried subtle weight. Hamburg had been the primary destination for Sebastian Von Vogel's more questionable wartime shipments. "Business continues to evolve with the political landscape," Morrison responded neutrally. The Cold War creates unique transportation requirements that our infrastructure is well positioned to address. Indeed, the movement of goods, and occasionally people, across ideological boundaries offers considerable opportunity for those with established networks. Gregory delicately sliced into his lemon tart. Some networks, I've observed, have roots stretching back to previous conflicts. Morrison's expression remained pleasantly inscrutable. History provides valuable lessons for those who study it carefully. Precisely my philosophy, Gregory agreed. For instance, I recently reviewed some fascinating documentation regarding Operation Crossroads. Such creative transportation solutions employed during times of crisis. The reference to Morrison's wartime intelligence assignment hung between them like smoke, unexpected, potentially dangerous. Morrison maintained his composed demeanor while rapidly calculating possibilities. Gregory's knowledge seemed improbably specific. Military history offers endless case studies in logistical innovation, Morrison replied carefully. Though I find contemporary challenges more immediately engaging, the past and present often intertwine more directly than we acknowledge. Gregory's eyes held Morrison's steadily. Railway infrastructure, for example, maintains remarkable continuity despite changing ownership. The Von Vogel lines may lie dormant, but their potential remains significant. Morrison allowed himself a small, appreciative smile. You've always possessed an admirable talent for connecting disparate elements, Inspector, a quality that occasionally exceeds the boundaries of official inquiry. He leaned forward slightly, curiosity genuinely piqued. What drives this decades-long crusade of yours? After all this time, what outcome could possibly justify such persistent attention? Gregory set down his teacup with precision, his expression shifting subtly. My sister fled England in 1942, carrying evidence that could have destroyed several prominent families and institutions. She chose silence and exile over justice, sacrificing her reputation and homeland to protect her unborn child. Something personal flickered in his eyes. History has forgotten her sacrifice, painted her as either conspirator or victim, when she was neither. Admirable loyalty to your Helena, Morrison observed, though something in his expression shifted at Helena's name. A momentary softening around the eyes, quickly masked, though one might question whether Helena herself would desire this posthumous excavation of painful history. Helena deserves vindication, Gregory replied, a quiet intensity in his voice. Her spirit deserves peace. For 25 years she lived with the weight of knowledge she never shared, even with her daughter. That burden shortened her life as surely as the illness that finally claimed her. Ah, Morrison said softly. So this is about redemption, not merely justice. Personal, not merely professional. The personal and professional have always intersected in this matter, Gregory acknowledged. As you well know, Mr. Morrison, his gaze sharpened. Perhaps better than anyone, Morrison's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of his coffee cup. What precisely are you suggesting, Inspector? Helena's journal entries from those summers make frequent reference to someone identified only as J, Gregory replied evenly. A junior transport liaison who shared her concerns about Sebastian's operations, who brought her poetry, who became significant to her during those final months in England. A weighted silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Many people worked at the railway office, Morrison observed finally, his voice carefully neutral despite the sudden tension in his shoulders. Indeed, Gregory agreed, though few maintained contacts with MI6 while developing independent relationships with Sebastian's staff. His expression softened unexpectedly. She kept your handkerchief, you know, among her most treasured possessions. Your initials were quite distinctive, JM embroidered in gold thread. The revelation struck with precision. Morrison's composed facade faltered momentarily, something raw and genuine flashing across his features before the professional mask reasserted itself. Helena Matthews was an exceptional woman, he said finally, his tone measured yet somehow different, more personal than their previous exchanges. Perceptive, principled, unwilling to look away from difficult truths. In another time, under different circumstances, he stopped himself, recalibrating. War creates impossible situations, Inspector, choices with no satisfactory outcomes. You loved her, Gregory stated simply. Not a question, but a quiet acknowledgement. Morrison met his gaze directly. What I felt for Helena has no bearing on current operations. Ancient history, as they say. Is it? Gregory asked. Or does her daughter's presence in Yorkshire, her growing connection to Sullivan Von Vogel, stir echoes of the past you'd prefer remained buried? We all contained contradictions during wartime, Morrison replied, neatly sidestepping the direct question. Necessity created strange alignments, temporary alliances, convenient partnerships. The greater good required occasional moral flexibility. The greater good, Gregory repeated. A wonderfully elastic concept that stretches to accommodate whatever actions one wishes to justify. Morrison leaned back. His posture relaxed despite the conversation's undercurrents. What Helena never fully grasped, what perhaps even you don't appreciate, is that sometimes true justice requires working outside conventional systems. What appears as betrayal from one angle might be necessary sacrifice from another. A convenient philosophy for those who profit from such sacrifices, Gregory observed, or a practical one for those who understand how power truly functions, Morrison countered gently. Helena saw fragments, not the complete picture. Her journals reflect that limited perspective. Did you ever wonder, Gregory asked carefully, what might have happened had you chosen her over your operation? Had you offered to leave with her that October night when she decided to flee? The question landed like a physical blow. Morrison's expression remained composed, but something in his eyes, a flash of old pain, perhaps regret, betrayed the impact. We make choices, Inspector, he replied after a moment. We live with their consequences. Helena chose protection for her child over the pursuit of justice. I chose the completion of my mission over other considerations. We all did what we believed necessary at the time. And now, what necessity drives your current expansion along the old Von Vogel routes? Morrison's professional demeanor reasserted itself. Business opportunity, primarily. The Cold War creates unique transportation requirements that traditional shipping cannot adequately address. I would be careful about cultivating connections between your protégé and my niece, Gregory said, changing direction. History has demonstrated the volatility of Matthews Von Vogel interactions. Young people often ignore historical precedent, Morrison observed, though I share your concern regarding potential complications. Gregory finished his tea, placing the cup precisely on its saucer. Sullivan seems remarkably like his uncle in certain respects. The same intensity, the same single-minded focus. One hopes he hasn't inherited Sebastian's more problematic traits as well. We all inherit complexities from our forebears, Morrison replied, though I suspect your concern for Sullivan's character is somewhat disingenuous. On the contrary, Gregory corrected, I would prefer not to see history repeat its more tragic patterns. Helena deserved better than what happened in 1942. Sonya deserves better than becoming entangled in the same web that ensnared her mother, and yet you've brought her directly into that web by inviting her to Yorkshire, Morrison pointed out. Curious strategy, if protection is your genuine concern. Gregory's expression grew contemplative. Sometimes, the only way forward is through the past, not around it. Helena's silence was meant to protect Sonya, but it left her incomplete. A daughter without half her history, without understanding of her mother's choices. Understanding rarely brings comfort in such matters, Morrison noted. Some truths serve no purpose beyond disruption. Helena believed otherwise, Gregory replied simply. Her final wish was for the truth to emerge when it could no longer harm her daughter directly. That time has come. Morrison studied him, something almost wistful crossing his features. You know, in another life, we might have been allies rather than adversaries, Inspector. We both recognized her exceptional qualities, both sought to protect her in our own ways. Yet with decidedly different outcomes, Gregory observed. and different definitions of protection. Results rather than intentions define history's judgment, Morrison acknowledged, though intentions perhaps matter in more personal evaluations. As they prepared to depart, Morrison extended one final observation. Your niece may find Yorkshire more compelling than you believe, Inspector. Some attractions transcend historical awareness. Indeed, Gregory acknowledged. Though I trust Sonya to navigate complex terrain with appropriate caution, caution rarely accompanies attraction, Morrison noted. As our mutual history rather dramatically illustrates, they parted with formal courtesy, handshakes, polite nods, the choreographed civility of longtime adversaries. Only their eyes betrayed the true nature of their encounter. A warning exchanged, boundaries tested, new calculations necessitated by evolving circumstances. As Morrison watched Gregory depart, he found himself reaching for the inner pocket where an embroidered handkerchief had resided for decades. A memento he'd long told himself he kept merely as insurance, should questions about Helena ever resurface. The fabric, worn thin with age and handling, carried initials that had once been crisp and golden. The journal in his other pocket seemed suddenly heavier, its latest entry already obsolete, considering this unexpected development. Gregory Constant knew more than he should, yet revealed less than he could, a concerning equation that demanded swift resolution. Morrison signaled for the bill, his mind already plotting for vulnerable operations. The game had evolved, pieces rearranged on a board decades in the making. Somewhere in Yorkshire, Sullivan and Sonya moved toward each other, unaware of the historical forces aligning around them like gathering storm clouds. History poised to repeat itself in ways neither Gregory nor Morrison could fully control.